Hello Daily Drafters and welcome back to the channel for the continuation of the Brothers War Limited Set review. Yesterday we took a look at blue, and today we'll be taking a look at every single black card in the set. Don't forget that I'm reviewing these cards before the set has released and before anyone has had a chance to play with them, so I will obviously be getting some of these cards wrong. But over the course of the entire format, you can tune back into the channel to see how I've adjusted the value of some of the cards over time. In addition to reviewing every single card in this set for Limited, I'll be producing archetype guides, pre-release primers, and other content related to the release of the Brothers War, so if you've stumbled across this video, and any or all of that sounds of interest to you, feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all things Brothers War in preparation for its release. Lastly, before we dive in, I will be using the Limited Resources letter grade system to grade each of these cards here today, and if you're unfamiliar with that system, you can find that information in this video's description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's take a look at today's first black card. First up is Ashnod Flesh Mechanist, which is a single black mana for a 1/1 human artificer at rare. It has Death Touch, and it says whenever Ashnod attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, create a tapped Powerstone token. You can also pay 5 generic mana and exile a creature card from your graveyard to create a tapped 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. The floor on this card is a 1 mana 1/1 Death Touch, which is already decent, and it's interesting that this triggers on attacks. I'm not sure how often you'll be able to attack with this. If you play it on turn 1, you still have to have a creature to sacrifice, and by that time, your opponent should have a blocker set up. Now, the activated ability is pretty nice because Power Stones can help pay for it, which makes it cheaper. Overall, I think the floor is pretty high with this, and I'm going to give it a B. Next we have Ashnod's Intervention, which is a black mana for an instant at common, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When this creature dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. The fact that this creature goes back to your hand is a huge downside with this card. I suppose the joke is that you can return an unearthed creature to your hand for more value, or a smaller prototype creature, but I just don't really think it's worth a card in most scenarios, because if you try to use this to trade up, they could just kill your creature in response and you get nothing. I'm giving it a D. Next we have Battlefield Butcher, which is 2 and a black for a 1/4 human soldier at uncommon. And for 5 generic mana, you can tap this to have each opponent lose 2 life, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each creature card in your graveyard. This thing could be a serious problem in the right deck. If you've got access to a couple of Power Stones and have a couple of creatures in your yard, this could be 1 or 2 mana to tap and ping them for 2. Now, this could also be 5 mana at its worst, which is not great. I'm not sure that this pulls me into black necessarily, but when I already have Power Stones and Graveyard Synergies in my deck, and I see this card late, it'll be a nice include. I'm giving it a C+. Next up is Carrion Locust, which is 2 and a black for a 2/1 insect horror at common. It has flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. If it was a creature card, that player loses 1 life. We've seen plenty of 3 mana 2/1 flyers with upside lately, and this upside is definitely minor. There will be times where this nabs a key unearthed creature or something relevant, but sometimes it just hits a random card that neither player really cares about. I think a 3 mana 2/1 flyer is about a D+, and I'll let this ability bump it up to a C-. Next we have Corrupt, which is 5 and a black for a sorcery at uncommon, and it says Corrupt deals damage to any target equal to the number of swamps you control. You gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So, just like we saw with the white removal spell, I think on average, by the time you have 6 mana, you will have either 3 or 4 swamps on the battlefield, which would make this drain for 3 or 4 for 6 mana, and it's only a sorcery. In heavy black decks, I think this will be decent, but in a typical 9 or 8 swamp deck, which will likely be most decks in the format, I think this is a little clunky to be premium. I'm giving it a C-. Next up we have Diabolic Intent, which is 1 and a black for a sorcery at rare, and as an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to sacrifice a creature, and you may search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then shuffle. Tutors in Limited usually don't quite get there. I think this is specifically a build around, and I would only include this card in my deck if I had sufficient sack fodder and I had an insane bomb or 2 that I was desperate to search up. In that exact case, I think this could perform at about a build around C+. Next up is Disciples of Gix, which is 4 and 2 black for a 4/4 Phyrexian human at uncommon, And it says when it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 3 artifact cards, put them into your graveyard, and then shuffle. If you've built your deck correctly, this card can be insanely powerful. There's several artifacts with Unearth, and you can bin creatures with this to help out with your green-black deck. You can find some large prototype artifacts to reanimate or return to your hand, and you still get a 4/4 body out of the deal. Again, in the right deck, I think this card is a B. Next up is Disfigure, which is a single black mana for an instant at common, and it gives target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. We've seen this card before, and it's usually a pretty good removal spell. It always depends on how important the small creatures in the format are to kill, but if we think about Flowstone Infusion from Dominaria United, which is a similar effect, that came out to be about a C+ by the end of the format, and I think I'll start Disfigure there as well at a C+. Next up we have Dreams of Steel and Oil, which is a black mana for a sorcery at uncommon, and it says target opponent reveals their hand, you choose an artifact or creature card from it, then choose an artifact or creature card from their graveyard, exile the chosen cards. Wow, these effects are usually never worth it in Limited. Sometimes they're just not great targets, or these effects end up being too expensive, or any combination in between. This one costs just 1 mana, and it exiles, and it can nab something out of their graveyard too. It's not a great top deck late, but this is a pretty nice little Thoughtseize effect here, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next is Emergency Weld, which is 1 and a black for a sorcery at common, and it returns target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand, create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. So you could think of this card as a 2-mana 1/1 that returns a creature from your graveyard to your hand, except this does have to have a legal target in your yard to be put on the stack, so it's not quite that good, but it is still good. It's a pretty good card in both the mid and late portions of the game, and it's probably a pretty good top deck in most scenarios. I think this card is a C+. Next up is Fateful Handoff, which is 3 and a black for a sorcery at rare, and you get to draw cards equal to the mana value of target artifact or creature you control. An opponent gains control of that permanent. I'm wondering if there's some sort of cute combo you can pull here, like a big 7 mana 1/1 with a huge ETB that you can just donate to your opponent in exchange for drawing 7 cards. Also, if you donate your smaller prototype creature, you only draw equal to the prototype's mana value, not the larger creatures. I think the joke here is to donate an unearthed creature to them so that it dies on end step, but that's super mana intensive. If you're just drawing 4 cards and giving your opponent a 4-drop, how happy are you with that? Well, it also depends on your board state. So many things depend with this card, and it's very hard to grade as a result. I think if you build your deck around good ETBs, you can probably get good use out of this, and I'll give it a B as a result. Next we have Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, which is 1 and 2 black for a 3/3 Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. And it says whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. You can also pay 4 and 3 black and discard X cards. You then exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. You may play lands and cast spells from among the cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Well, we've got one of the biggest bombs in the set here. It's a little small and vulnerable to removal, but I think that's a good thing on balance. The first line of text is worded strangely for Commander, but it basically reads that when a creature you control deals damage to an opponent, you may pay a life to draw a card. Well, yes please. And the activation seems pretty expensive, but remember that Power Stones can pay for the colorless part as well. If your opponent can't answer this, they lose. It's an A. Next up is Gix's Caress, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery at common. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Create a tapped Powerstone token. So here's a clunkier version of Dreams of Steel and Oil that we saw earlier. Yes, you get a Powerstone, and certain decks will definitely want that, but how often does a 3-mana card like this make the cut? Usually just playing any 3-drop or card draw spell or removal spell demotes this to the sideboard. If Power Stones are harder to come by than I'm imagining, this may be playable as a Power Stone maker, but I'm thinking it's mainly just a D+. Next is Gix's Command, which is 3 and 2 black for a sorcery at rare, and you get to choose 2. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Destroy each creature with power 2 or less. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, and each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control. We've got another great command here. This one is the most expensive so far at 5 mana, and it's just a sorcery, but if you're able to regrow 2 creatures and kill their biggest thing for 5 mana, you'll be ecstatic. I was debating between A- and B+ with this one, but I think when this is good, it's just so much value, so I'll give it an A-. Next up is Gixian Infiltrator, which is 1 and a black for a 2/1 Phyrexian human at common, and it says whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Gixian Infiltrator. So the red-black archetype cares about sacrificing artifacts, and this guy is going to be able to trigger off of that theme relatively well. I think the most likely scenario for this card is just to have it trade with their 2 or 3 drop before it really snowballs out of control. It has upside, and it's fine as a 2 drop in the right deck. I'm giving it a C. Next we have Gixian Puppeteer, which is 3 and a black for a 4/3 Phyrexian Warlock at rare. It says whenever you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And whenever it dies, return another target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you're never able to trigger the first part of this card, what grade would a 4 mana 4/3 that reanimates a 3 drop on death be? Probably at least a B. If you can trigger that first ability 2 or 3 times before it dies, you've got a 4 mana 4/3 that reanimates a 3 drop that drained them for like 6. That's excellent. The upside pushes this into bomb status for me. I'm giving it an A-. Next we have Gixian Skullflayer, which is 2 and a black for a 2/3 Phyrexian Human Assassin at common, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Gixian Skullflayer. It's always difficult to judge how easy it will be to hit certain graveyard thresholds before each set releases. I think 3 is probably achievable by maybe turn 5 or 6, unless you also have some self-mill or something. This thing doesn't have any evasion, so even if it slowly grows and grows, it's not like it can fly over your defenses or anything. It's not great before it starts growing, and I think the text bumps it slightly, but not a ton. I think it's about a C in the decks that want it. Next up is Gnawing Vermin, which is a black mana for a 1/1 creature rat at uncommon, and it says when it ETBs, target player mills 2 cards, and when Gnawing Vermin dies, target creature you don't control gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Well, speaking of a way to mill yourself, here's a decent one. I think basically only green-black decks will want this card. I'm not sure I'd run it for just the second ability. This gives me vibes of like Shambling Ghast from AFR, which ended up being a solid playable, and I think this is 2 in the right deck. I'll give it a C. Next up is Go for the Throat, which is 1 and a black for an instant at uncommon, and it says destroy target non-artifact creature. I know there are a lot of artifact creatures in this set, but compare this to like Power Word Kill from AFR in a Dragon Heavy set, or Cast Down from Dominaria in a Legendary Heavy set. They're still great removal spells that are definitely premium includes. This is a B+. Next we have Gruesome Realization, which is 1 and 2 black for a sorcery at uncommon, and you get to choose one. You can either draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, or creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is either a strictly worse and hard to cast divination, or a sideboard card. I don't think you should main deck this card in this format unless you're desperate for draw 2 effects, and maybe you bring it in out of the sideboard as a sideboard C-. Next up is Gurgling Anointer, which is 2 and a black for 1/3 Phyrexian Horror at uncommon. It has flying, and it says whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, return another target creature card with mana value less than or equal to its power from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now this is a creature I want my draw 2 payoffs to be on. The fact that this is a flyer is huge game compared to the Skullflayer, which doesn't fly. Also, it does a good Gixian Puppeteer impression on death by reanimating something. As long as you're able to get even 1 counter on this, I think you're in business. And in that deck and scenario, I'm giving this a B. Next up is Hostile Negotiations, which is 3 and a black for an instant at rare, and it says exile the top 3 cards of your library in a face-down pile, then exile the top 3 cards of your library in another face-down pile. Look at the cards in each pile, then turn a pile of your choice face up. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard, you lose 3 life. Well, this is a fun twist on a fact or fiction type of effect. Now I get to choose the face-up pile, and then you get to decide which to give me. I think in most cases, you'll end up with something good out of these piles, so 4 mana draw 3 at instant speed is pretty good. You do have to lose 3 life to do it, which is a downside, but I think the rate is pretty good, and it's still a clear 3 for 1. I'm giving it a B-. Next we have Killzone Acrobat, which is 2 and a black for a 3/2 human soldier at common. And whenever it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature or artifact. If you do, it gains flying until end of turn. This seems like a steep cost just for flying. I think this belongs in only very aggressive red-black decks that have a bunch of sacrifice fodder. I can't see myself activating this any more than maybe once or twice in a game to try to close it out. Overall, I probably just won't be putting this in my deck. I'll give it a D. Next we have Misery's Shadow, which is 1 and a black for a 2/2 shade at rare. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. And for 1 generic mana, you can give it +1/+1 until end of turn. Well, this is definitely a nice bear with upside. I think its first line of text is probably more important than you might think in this set with Unearth and Reanimation running around, and it's just a single colorless mana to pump it +1/+1, and that's an insane rate. In the late game, this becomes a must block on threat of activation alone. I love when my 2-drop is still relevant in the late game, and I think this card will perform like a B+. Next is Moment of Defiance, which is 2 and a black for an instant at common, and it gives target creature +2/+1 and lifelink until end of turn, and you draw a card. I really prefer my combat tricks to cost 1 or 2 mana. I know this one replaces itself, and that's probably enough to at least consider this in aggressive blue-black decks where you're trying to draw 2 cards in a turn, but I always come back to the point of how often can you afford to put a 3-mana combat trick in your deck over like a 3-mana creature or a removal spell? My thought is not often, so I'll give this a D+. Next is No One Left Behind, which is 4 and a black for a sorcery at uncommon, and this spell costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature with mana value 3 or less, and you get to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I love this card. I think this card will be the backbone of an entire Reanimator deck in this format, particularly because of Prototype. I just can't wait to dump a big 9-mana 9/9 in my yard and reanimate it on turn 5 with this card. My bias will probably get in the way of my grade here, but I'm gonna will this card into a B-. Next we have Overwhelming Remorse, which is 4 and a black for an instant at common, and it says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard, and it exiles target creature or planeswalker. So at 5 mana, this card is fine, probably about a C or a C+, and in a creature-heavy deck that can reduce its costs, I think it will be a great removal spell, and I'd probably run at least a couple. I think the corner case scenarios are enough to push this to a B- for me. Next up is Painful Quandary, which is 3 and 2 black for an enchantment at rare, and it says whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. Woof. So this is a 5-mana do-nothing enchantment, but if you're in a top deck war, your opponent gets like 2 draw steps to try to get out of it. 5 mana for do nothing is a lot, but I think if this card was on the other side of the battlefield against you, how do you play around it? Every single card you cast costs either 5 life or another card out of your hand. I don't know how I would get around this card and still win the games unless I was already so far ahead. Its horrible effect when you're behind keeps it out of bomb range for me, but I think it's still a solid B. Next up is Powerstone Fracture, which is 1 and a black for a sorcery at common, and as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature to destroy target creature or planeswalker. So Bone Splinters now has an extra 1 mana attached to it to open up the ability to sack an artifact as well. In DMU, Bone Splinters was probably about a C in the right deck, and the extra mana and ability to sack an artifact probably keeps it right about there for me at a C. Next up is Ravenous Gigamole, which is 3 and a black for a 2/3 mole horror at common, and when it ETBs, you mill 3 cards. You may put a creature card from among the milled cards this way into your hand, and if you don't, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So I think this is the best version of this effect in all the colors that we've seen so far. You either get a 4-mana 2/3 that could potentially return a creature among 3 milled cards, or a 4-mana 3/4. Also, the mill in black is probably the most important to have self-mill attached to it. I don't think this is super outstanding or anything, but in a black deck that cares about the graveyard, I think it's a solid playable at a C+. Next up is Thran Vigil, which is 1 and a black for an enchantment at uncommon, and it says whenever 1 or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard during your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So here we have yet another do-nothing card, but at least this one only costs 2. You need a ton of Unearth and Reanimation to really maximize this, and I'm not sure how much of that exists in black specifically, but in that build-around deck specifically, this is probably about a C-. Next we have Thraxodemon, which is 1 and a black for a 2/2 demon at common, and for 3 generic mana you can tap this to sacrifice another creature or artifact to draw a card. So ideally Power Stones can help you get this cost down to maybe just 1 mana or so, but there's just so many different cards that want things to be sacrificed that we've seen so far, but not a ton of great sack fodder. Granted, we haven't looked at red yet, so maybe that improves, but I think of this card like I did Soul Reaper of Mogis from Theros Beyond Death, and that card was probably about a C, so I'll start this at C as well. Next we have Trench Stalker, which is 4 and a black for a 4/5 Beast Horror at common, and as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it has Death Touch and a lifelink. I think you need at least 3 or so ways to draw 2 cards in a turn to care about this, and if you're in the draw 2 deck specifically and lacking high drops, maybe you could be fine including a copy of this, but I don't think it's outstanding, and I'm not sure you'll be missing it if you don't end up with a copy of it by the end of the draft, and that is a C- for me. Next is Ashnod's Harvester, which is 2 generic mana for a 3/1 artifact creature construct at uncommon, and whenever it attacks, you exile target card from a graveyard, and it unearths for 1 and a black. This is a decent little aggressive creature, and the cheap unearth cost makes it pretty appealing for black-red decks who want to be sacking artifacts. This could trade off early and then come back, hit them for 3, and then accrue more value when you sack it. All on a 2-drop, that's pretty good. I think in the right deck, this is a C+. Next up is Clay Revenant, which for 1 mana is a 1/2 golem at common. It ETBs tapped, and for 2 and a black, you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. Now here is the recurable sack fodder I want in my black-red decks. For just 1 mana, I get an artifact that can continually return to my hand for ideally just 1 or 2 mana with the help of Power Stones. I think black-red decks will be disappointed if they don't end up with a copy or 2 of this. I'm giving it a C+. Next up is Dredging Claw, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has Menace, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may attach Dredging Claw to it, and it equips for 1 and a black. So this is clearly a heavy unearth build around. If you have 0 unearth cards in your deck, I would never include this. If you have 2 or 3, maybe you could start considering it, but honestly, I don't think I would until I had a dedicated unearth aggro deck, which unfortunately is red-white in this format. I just don't think this finds a spot in the main deck very often at all. I'm giving it a D. Next is Goring Warplow, which is 6 mana for a 5/4 with Death Touch, or 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 1/1 with Death Touch. I'm almost more interested in the prototype version of this card. 2 mana 1/1 Death Touchers are usually fine, and Death Touch on a bigger creature usually doesn't matter too much. I guess it is nice that your 2 mana Death Toucher is a 5/4 in the late game top deck, and that's nice, so I'll give this card a C+. Next up is Phyrexian Fleshgorger, which is 7 mana for a 7/5 Menace lifelink that also has the text Ward, pay life equal to its power, or it's 1 and 2 black for a 3/3 with that same text box. Man, are you kidding me? This might be the best card in the set. If you get access to this card in the draft, you should do everything in your power to make sure you can cast its 7 mana side. At 7 mana, a 7/5 with Menace and lifelink and a ward that basically says you lose the game is incredible. Oh, and you have the buyout prototype version too if you're desperate. This is an A+. Next is Razorlash Transmogrant, which is 2 mana for a 3/1 artifact creature zombie at rare. It can't block, and for 4 and 2 black, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. This ability costs 4 less to activate if an opponent controls 4 or more non-basic lands. So in Limited, you'll never get the discount, but again, Power Stones can help with this. I wouldn't play this in a non-black deck, but in a black deck with at least some access to Power Stones, this is a nice aggressive creature that can return over and over, similar to Skyclave Shade in Zendikar Rising. I'll give this a B-. Next up is Scrapwork Rager, which is 4 mana for a 2/2 Phyrexian Horror at common. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose a life, and it can unearth for 3 and a black. Well, here's a 3.5 for 1 on a stick. This is just 1 mana more than Phyrexian Rager from Dominaria United, and it has Unearth to get the effect again if you want it. And Black-Red usually has some decent ways to sack artifacts or value, so in that deck, this will be a great include. So much so that I think this even is a reason to draft that deck, and I'm giving it a B-. Next up is Transmogrant Altar, which is 3 generic mana for an artifact at uncommon. You can pay a black and tap it, and sacrifice a creature to add 3 colorless mana, or you can pay 2 generic and tap it, and sacrifice a creature to create a 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token only as a sorcery. So here's a nice little recurring sack outlet that I mentioned I was looking for from earlier. Unfortunately for us limited players, this first ability probably won't do much. Maybe it can help pay for some of these expensive activated abilities. This second ability seems like a nice unearth build around, albeit expensive. Prioritize Power Stones in a deck with this, and build it like an unearth ETB value deck, and I think you'll be happy. In that deck, it's probably about a C. Our last black card is Transmogrant's Crown, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment at rare. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and whenever equipped creature dies, you draw a card, and it equips for either 2 generic mana or a single black. Well, hello there. I like drawing cards. This gives me Skullclamp vibes, and if you have a board stall, just suit up any of your creatures any turn to cast them in for cards. You can bury your opponent in card advantage with this on the battlefield, not to mention keep beating down with extra powered attackers. I'd love to open this card early. I'm giving it a B. Before we wrap up here, I did want to mention that there are 63 additional cards in this set that will appear in booster packs on MTG Arena called Retro Artifacts. These cards are similar to the Mystical Archive cards that we saw in Strixhaven, in that there's guaranteed to be exactly one of these in each pack. All 63 of these cards are reprints, and I will not be including dialogue in any of my set review videos going over each of these cards. However, if you're interested in my grade for these 63 cards, I've included those grades in the description of this video. That'll do it for today's portion of the Brothers War set review. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow for more daily draft content.